Think back 6 months ago, specifically to December 31st, 2019. How did you spend New Year's Eve? What did you do to ring in 2020? This past New Year's Eve, my husband and some friends and I, we gathered and we played a board game. Now, it wasn't just any board game. It wasn't Pictionary or Euchre or Settlers of Catan. We played a board game called Pandemic. Let me just read you a little bit about what the game is about. The world ended almost 71 years ago. A virulent plague came out of nowhere and ravaged the world. For 3 generations, small groups of survivors have struggled to keep the world alive. But their efforts are no longer enough. Cities are falling off the grid and supplies are running low. The world is in need of a group of heroes to emerge and lead it through this crisis. And this task has fallen to you. You are humanity's last chance. Oh, little did we know as we sat around playing and celebrating and ringing in 2020. Since the words COVID-19 and self-isolate and slow the spread have become part of our everyday vocabulary, Canadian Baptist Ministries, or CBM, has started hosting online conversations several times a week, and I've listened to a number of them and have really appreciated them. A few weeks ago, CBM hosted a conversation about race relations in the United States. And Tanika Shepard, the president of Baptist Women of North America, was part of the conversation. And Tanika talked about the killings of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd, and how all of this was occurring in the midst of a pandemic where African Americans are dying at disproportionate rates of COVID-19. And she said, "This is the pandemic inside the pandemic." And I thought that that was really helpful language. And yes, she was speaking from an American context, but let's not let the differences between Canada and America divert our attention away from our own pandemic inside the pandemic here in Canada. And if you haven't already listened to the 2-part conversation that Doss took part in about racism in Canada, I urge you to listen to it. And in addition to that, Cheryl Bear had a conversation with CBM about the impact of COVID-19 on Indigenous communities. And go ahead and watch that one too. We just heard Esther read, "Live your lives in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ." And so today I want to put this question before us. What does it mean to live our lives worthy to the gospel of Christ when we are living in a pandemic inside a pandemic? You know, maybe you wish we could talk about something just a little bit lighter, like what did you eat for breakfast this morning? Or where do you do your grocery shopping? Or which golf course did you golf at this week? I'm not a golfer, I don't golf at all, so I can't answer that question. Or where did you get your hair cut? Or when are you getting your hair cut? I can answer that. June 24th at 2 p.m. I can't wait. When Paul wrote Philippians, which is a letter to the church in Philippi, he was facing his own crisis. He was in prison, and this is where he wrote his letter from, and he was facing the possibility of being executed. And this letter is an update to the church. Paul wanted to update his friends on how he was doing, and he wanted to thank them for their financial support for him during prison. And he also uses this letter as an opportunity to talk about what it means to live for Christ in a hostile environment. And so that's the context that Paul is urging the church to live their lives in a worthy manner, or in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. Or as the Message translation puts it, live in such a way that you are a credit to the message of Christ. And so what we're talking about here is not private and personal. It's public and it's communal. And so it's not just saying, hey, Thelma or Shelley or T or Becky or Bob or Ruth or Alice or Philemon or Katie, how do you personally live your way in a way that reflects Jesus when no one is looking? That is a really important question that we do need to answer, but that's not the context of our question today. The live in this text is about public behavior. It's about public citizenship, and it has political overtones. And so that's why another translation of Philippians 1, chapter 1, verse 27 says, your public behavior must match up to the gospel of the King. And there's a few things we need to know about Philippi for just a bit more context. It was a city in northern Greece, and it was a Roman colony. And when there were imperial celebrations or local cult festivals where the gods would be worshipped, or when Caesar would come through the town or the city wanting to be honored and worshipped and celebrated, everyone would gather together and come together for these festivities and this worship, except for the Jesus followers, because they followed Jesus as their Lord and their God, and not Caesar. And so when they didn't show up to these celebrations, it was noticed. And that's one example of their public behavior as a church. And so when people looked at the church community of Philippi, they could look at their public behavior and say, oh, if they're going to act like that, if they are going to treat people like that, then I want nothing to do with them. Or they could look at their public behavior and say, who is this king that they follow? Who is this Jesus that they love and that they serve? And so we can ask ourselves, what do people say when they look at the public behavior of Highland Baptist Church? Does our public behavior give credit to the message of Christ? Does our response to COVID-19 match up to the gospel of Christ? Is our response to racism worthy of the gospel of Christ? And it's a lot more straightforward to answer questions about breakfast and grocery stores and golf and hair appointments. And if you were asked those questions, you probably would have immediate answers to them. There wouldn't be any awkward silences as you try to reach for an answer. And I have been wondering how silence fits into all of this and about different types of silence. Some of you, especially those who are living alone, have felt the sting of loneliness during these COVID days, especially before things started to open up just a bit more. Things were too silent. You would turn on the TV or the radio just for some background noise because the silence was just too much. Others, on the other hand, have struggled to find even a moment of silence. Everyone is home, the noise is constant, and you try to escape from the noise, but you just can't. And then there's the silence about racism. When nothing is said, there's the silence about systematic racism. There is silence when a friend or a family member makes a racist comment. There is silence about the plight of Indigenous communities and their lack of access to clean drinking water. There is silence about Black Lives Matter. And then some of you haven't been silent about racism. Some of you experience racism every day, and you have shared your stories and experiences. Some of you have long pointed out that systematic racism is taking place right before our eyes. And then there is this long-held spiritual practice of silence before the living and loving God. And this is the type of silence I want to invite us towards today. This isn't the type of silence that leads to inaction or disengagement. This isn't the type of silence that says, oh, we just need to pray away systematic racism. This isn't the type of silence that takes the place of reading and education and active listening. This is a type of silence that creates space for the Spirit of God to move and to work and to speak and to guide and to make us aware of things. This is a type of silence that fosters the opportunity for deep connection with God. Since COVID-19, I have talked to a number of people who are noticing and appreciating things in a new way. And for myself, I have spent a lot more time in our backyard. And I always knew we had squirrels and birds and chipmunks, but I never really actually took the time to sit and to stop and to notice them. And I'm becoming more aware of the things that we already had that I really appreciate, like our deck and our umbrella and our lawn chairs. In a similar way, when we allow room for silence, we start to notice things that have been there all along, but our senses are just suddenly awakened. We start to realize things that we have been completely ignorant of. We might even be awakened for our need for repentance. Author Andrew Root tells about a time when his 9-year-old daughter was really fretting about school. Reading was a challenge, math was a challenge, and the social pressure was increasing. And this is what he said to her. When things are at their hardest, we must together open our eyes and ready ourselves for God's arrival. Silence provides the opportunity for us to open our eyes and ready ourselves for God's arrival. I want to encourage you to have 3 intentional times of silence at any point this week. It can be 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever length of time that works best for you. And it doesn't matter if you're outside or sitting or standing. What matters is that you are intentional about finding the most quiet space you possibly can that's available to you. And as you sit or stand or walk in silence in the presence of God this week, I want us to ask ourselves these 2 questions. What does it mean for us, for Highland Baptist Church, to live a life worthy of the gospel of Christ right now in the midst of a pandemic, inside the pandemic? And the second question, what fruitful labor is God calling us to right now? What fruitful labor is God calling you to right now in the midst of COVID-19 and in the midst of an increased awareness of systematic racism? I mentioned that Paul was facing the very real possibility of execution when he wrote Philippians. And he writes that if he lives, he has a lot of fruitful labor ahead of him. He has churches to teach and encourage and to challenge about what it means to follow Jesus. And so what fruitful labor is God calling us to right now? Now, I don't expect magical things to happen in 10 minutes of silence, but I do wonder, and I kind of want to imagine what would happen if 5 of us, or 10 of us, or 25 of us, or 50 or 75 of us created rhythms and patterns in our lives where we create space for silence before God. Right now, I feel like my life is really noisy, and it's not just because I have young kids. My social media feeds, my book stack, my podcast queue, the news articles I want to read, the people I want to listen to, the stories I want to listen to are numerous. And there are some things that I really need to read. There are some things that I really need to learn. There are some voices that I really need to listen to. And there are some things that I am just too ignorant about. And I'm afraid that if we don't create space for silence in the presence of God, everything will just feel like noise. And we will miss the voices that need to be heard. We will bypass the people we need to learn from, and we will be so distracted that our capacity for active listening and being learners will be diminished. And so would you join me in creating space 3 times this week as we ask God, what does it mean for Highland Baptist Church to live a life worthy of the gospel of Christ right now?